Okay, great. So anyway, thank you all for joining me today for this webinar on TreeAge Pro. Our focus today is on transparency and debugging and validation of models, because we hear complaints, and maybe not from this group, but from people who don't want to use TreeAge Pro, that it's not transparent, that it's a black box. And we don't agree with that. But if people don't know how to see behind the scenes to what TreeAge Pro is doing, they might get the feeling that it is a black box. So we want to use this webinar to try to show you how you can see behind the scenes and validate that the models are actually representing what you want it to represent. Because if we don't do that, then there's no point in building models. We need to be able to accurately represent disease processes and make you comfortable that we are actually doing that for you. So the focus is really on transparency, validation, and debugging. So the first thing about TreeAge Pro, and I'm going to open up an example model here that we're going to use, this Markov cancer decision, a fairly simple model. And these models are all available to you in your projects view, so you can use that anytime. But one of the nice things about TreeAge Pro is that you can see the patient pathways. So if you have to explain what this model does, you can just show them the pathways. Yes, there's 3 states, these are the events, and they're going to use this as a Markov process moving into the future, projecting into the future. So that's one big advantage of TreeAge Pro, is that it's quite easy to explain to people what a model does because it's right in front of you in terms of the patient pathways. But that's not good enough, because there's a lot of calculations that are going to occur, and you need to feel comfortable that those calculations are happening correctly as in a way that appropriately represents the disease. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So we'll use this Markov cancer decision model to start. And sure enough, you could build a model and you could say, oh, my model looks great. And you could come to the decision node and you could run the rankings and get an ICER and say, oh, great, I'm done. But that's really insufficient to feel comfortable that you've created the appropriate model. You really can't just build a model and go right to the rankings and say, I'm done, because you haven't really checked to see that the model is accurately representing the disease process. So yes, this is maybe the end point of where you're trying to get to, of the average cost and effectiveness per patient, given the 2 strategies, and the ICER that determines which one's the optimal strategy. But you shouldn't just jump right from one to the other, because you will make mistakes as you build a model, regardless of the software that you use, and you need to do a little bit more digging to make sure that those results are accurate. So while this is the end point, it's not the first point. So what you really need to do is you need to look at the flows within the model, within those Markov processes, and make sure that they're accurate. And the Markov cohort reports that we generate, we think, help you with that. So just briefly, we have a model with 2 strategies. The second one is just a clone of the first one, so they use the same structure. So I only had to build it once. 3 states, transition events, returning to the states, and then running for about 20 years. That's just the basic structure of the model. But when we want to look at the details, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Markov node, and we could do this at either of the 2 Markov nodes, but we're going to focus on the top one. And this button right here in the Analyze Perspective runs the extended Markov cohort report. It's also available in the analysis menu. And when we run this report, we get a lot of visibility into what that model is doing. And in order to kind of make that more clear, I'm going to show it side by side with the model. So I've got them both in the same pane. I'm just clicking and dragging this over to the side so I can see the model on one side and the report on the other. And the first thing you'll see is that the structure of the report follows the structure of the model. So you can see how your cohort is moving through the model. So here's my 3 states, local cancer, metastases, and dead. And here's my 3 states here, local cancer, metastases, and dead. Here are my transition events. And here are my transition events. Stay here, progress, die. Stay here, progress, die. Survive, die, survive, die. So the reporting is a perfect representation of what you designed in the model. And not just does it follow the structure, it shows you how the cohort is moving through the model. So let's look at that for a minute. So we start based on the initial probabilities with everyone in the local cancer state. And what do we see? In the first cycle, everyone's in the local cancer state. That's what we expect. Then if I went back and looked at the parameters, I know this probability is 15% and this probability is 2%. We should be able to see that progression in the model. And sure enough, that's what we see. We start with everyone, 15% progress, 2% die, and the remaining 83% remain in local cancer state. And that is the percentage breakdown in the next cycle. And you can follow that further. These are fixed probabilities. So in the second cycle, I start with 83%. I apply that 15% progression to that, and I end up with a little bit more than 12% progressing. And I apply the 2% death probability of the second cycle to the 83%, and end up with about 1.67% dying in the second cycle. So you can continue to look through this whole structure and see that your cohort is progressing through the model as you expect. But it doesn't end there. It's not just the flow of the cohort. We also need to make sure that our values are accumulating correctly. So for example, in the first cycle, the cost for local cancer is $20,000. So anyone in this state is accumulating $20,000 worth of cost. And the utility, if I go down a little bit, EFF local is 0.95. So what do we see out here in the report? This is half cycle corrected. That's why it's 10,000. So the 10,000 is half cycle corrected 20,000. Everyone was there. So we get the full $10,000 cost because everyone was at that state. So we should accumulate the full half cycle corrected 20,000 for a total cost accumulation of 10,000. And the same with the effectiveness, the 0.95 half cycle corrected is 0.47. And because everyone's there, we get the full 0.47 qualities added to our model. Now, as we go down to the next cycle, second cycle, which is stage one, everyone's not there. So we're only having 83% of the cohort there. That gets multiplied by the 20,000, and we end up with 16.6 thousand accumulated in cycle two, and 0.79 qualities accumulated in cycle two. So you can use these reports to validate the flows of the cohort through the model, and based on those flows, this is what I entered in the model, and this is how much is accumulated in the model. So it gives you full visibility into what that Markov model is doing. Now, before I move on, let me just check for questions. No questions yet? Okay, great. Now, so that's a cohort model, and that's not all you need. As we accumulate them cycle by cycle, you see you're getting changing distribution of your cohort amongst the states cycle by cycle. And if we scroll down to the very bottom, we get the total cost and total effectiveness. And those were the values that were used for our cost effectiveness analysis. So that's how you get these values that are really the ultimate output from your model. And not only that, if we expand that, we can see what was the source of the cost. So in essence, 100% of the cost and utility came from the health states. There were no cost utilities associated with the transitions or the events, but you can see that of the 436, 105 of it came from local cancer and 331 came from metastases. So it gives you a breakdown or a summary level breakdown of where in the model was generating all the cost and all the utility accumulation. So that's really a lot of visibility into what those models are doing. And I think that's really helpful in making sure that you feel comfortable that the model is representing the disease process. Now, that's for a cohort model, but not all models are cohort models, right? You may have a model that requires Monte Carlo simulation. And in those cases, typically that's because your model either requires heterogeneity, so you have cohort with different characteristics within that cohort, or individuals within that cohort with different characteristics, or you have events that need to be recorded where patient events affect future patient events. Those are both good reasons to run a simulation model. Now, this is not a simulation model. I'm just going to pretend it's a simulation model, and I'm going to run microsimulation or patient level simulation on this model because we're familiar with it. Now, I wanted to make some changes because if I really want to see details on the simulation, I want to know what happened to the patients. I don't just want the summary level data. I want the individual movements of the patients through that model. So that's what I'm going to do now. So in order to do that, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to go to the tree preferences. That's how the model's configured. And under analysis settings, there's an option called time reporting selection. It probably should have a better name for that. It's really recording patient movements through the model. So I'm just going to turn that on. I'm going to record all the payoffs. In case I wanted to limit the data, I could skip some. These are just counters in my model. And I'm also going to make one more change. I'm going to set the seeding so that I know I'm going to get the same results every time. You don't have to do this, but it's just a good way for me to be able to keep consistent with my presentation. So now I'm going to hit apply and close, and I'm going to come back here and pretend it's a simulation model, and I'm going to run microsimulation or individual patient simulation on this model, and I'll run 10,000 people through. And it's cranking through the 10,000 people, not too bad, nice and fast. And it takes a little while to collect the results because remember, it's recording every event within that 10,000 person cohort. So these are really the ultimate values, just like when we ran rankings on the model before. These two mean costs and the two mean effectiveness, those would be used for cost effectiveness analysis to give us an ICER, which is very close to what we got before. And the more patients you run, the closer you'll get to a true mean. But again, I don't want to rely just on this report. I want to see details. I want to be able to feel comfortable that my model is doing what I wanted. I designed it to do. So yes, I would eventually return to this, but for now I want to look a little deeper. So because I turn the time reporting on, I get these options. I get trial level reports, and I get cohort level reports. These reports you probably won't use very often. They're really just grids of data if you wanted to dump the data out to another software package or to Excel or something and do some post-processing. But the more useful reports are down here at the bottom, and let's look at this one. This is the first patient that went through our model, trial 1 of 10,000. This is the path that person took. So they started in local cancer, they progressed, then they were metastases for several cycles, and eventually in stage 8, they died. And that's just what happened to that patient. And this is how that person accumulated value. Half cycle corrected 10,000, now they're in the more expensive state, and then eventually the person died with a total accumulation of 410,000 and a total dollars of cost and 7.68 qualities. So that's the first person. And the second person, and the third person, and the fourth person, and this person died quickly, right? So I can look at any simulated patient within my cohort and see exactly what happened to that person, and use that to kind of evaluate the patient pathways and make sure they're being represented appropriately. So, and you could even come back here to the main results, look at the summary level data for one of these and say, okay, here's what feels like an outlier, and I could look at patient 16 and say, how did they get so much cost? Or I forget, I probably picked the wrong one, but I could go and look at an individual that appears to be an outlier and make sure that person took a realistic patient pathway. So yes, I can look at the individual patients, but I also want to be able to roll this up to the same kind of cohort level reporting that I was able to get from the straight up cohort analysis. So I'm going to close this trial report, and I'm going to open up the cohort level report. It takes a little while to run it. And what it's doing is it's aggregating all of those patient movements into the same kind of structure that we had from a cohort analysis. So sure enough, everyone started in the local cancer state. We know that from the initial probabilities. And now we see approximately, now remember, this is a patient simulation, so there's going to be a little noise. You won't have exact perfect 15%, but approximately 15%, because 1,538 of those 10,000 patients progressed in the first cycle. And 198 of the 10,000 people died in the first cycle. So what we've done is we've accumulated and aggregated all those patient individual pathways and the movement that those people took through the model into a cohort level report that gives you the same accurate cohort level reporting that you would get for a cohort for a cohort analysis report, a cohort analysis model as opposed to a simulation model. And that applies not just to the movements, but also to the accumulation of value and even the summary level values. So you can see this was the total cost, total effectiveness, and where they came from and how those things happened. So we give you a lot of visibility, not just into cohort models, but also into patient level models. This is a good time for questions. So I see a question has come in. So let me take that. Hi, Louise. Would you show the survival curve? Certainly. It's right here. Survival curve. And this is available. It's regardless of whether we ran it from a cohort analysis or from patient simulation. And here it identifies the dead state. It just assumes the dead one's at the bottom. If you put your dead state somewhere else, you'd select it. And now it's accumulating the data. So it just takes a little while. It takes a little longer on the simulation data than it does on the patient. And here's your survival curve, right? So you might validate this against a Kaplan-Meier curve that you've got from your research and say, okay, people are dying too fast or too slow. I've got some calibration issues that I need to deal with in this model to make it more accurate. There was another question. D, what's the difference between this method and using trackers? Well, trackers are very useful, and they're usually used to drive events in the future. So in a patient simulation model, you can record events so that patient history in the past can affect patient history or patient movements in the future. So trackers is more of a technique to facilitate accurate disease progression by allowing events to affect future events. Whereas this is more of just a reporting mechanism to give you visibility into what happened through those models. So they're related, but they're a little bit different in terms of the purpose. And yes, you could sometimes people add trackers just for reporting, but if you don't use these cohort level reports, you would just get the final values of each patient, as opposed to with this, you can see how it's happening to the individuals, how it's happening to the cohort at different points in the model, in different cycles. So the cohort, the history reports give you visibility into patient flows, accumulation of payoffs, as well as trackers. So that's kind of, so far I've shown you kind of visibility in terms of the primary reporting that comes out of these models. But sometimes you actually want to look even deeper into what's happening. And you may want to look at an individual calculation, complicated calculation, and say, I've got 6 or 7 things working into this calculation, and I want to make sure that it's doing what I think it's doing. So we're going to open up a slightly more complicated model. So I'll close everything here. Close all. And I'm going to open up a different model, which is the Markov cancer reporting. Again, you have all these models available to you. So I'm going to open up this one. And we're going to focus on one of the calculations in here that's a little bit more complicated than anything we've seen in the prior models, specifically this probability of an adverse event. And all you see is PAE because the details of that calculation are in the variable definition, which I'll show you now. So how is this PAE calculated? Well, it's a little bit complicated. It's right here. It comes out of a table, right? So it comes out of a table here, and that table has a whole bunch of data in it, right? A whole bunch of different values. This is the number of prior events. This is which state you're in, the local cancer or the metastases, and this is what treatment you're in, or excuse me, this is what treatment you're in, treatment 1 or treatment 2, and then which state you're in. So basically what I'm trying to say is this probability of adverse event is dependent on 3 things. How many prior events you've had, which treatment you're in, as well as which state you're in. So that's a kind of a complicated formula that we've used for that. And you could imagine in a real model, I mean, this is just a training model, but in a real model, you might have something like a heart score that determines the probability of a heart attack, of an MI. And there may be a whole bunch of factors that work into that, age and blood pressure and whatever else it is. I don't want to claim to be a cardiologist. But that might be an example of something that's really quite complicated that you built in your model. And just looking at those cohort reports isn't going to get you to how did that probability get calculated. But this debugging that I'm going to show you will get you to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to eventually run the model, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the configuration of the tree preferences of the model to look at that specific calculation of the model, PAE. So I'm going to come down here to debugging right here. And I'm going to say, I want to see output I don't want to see everything because that's just way too much data. I want to look at selected elements. I'll come back to how I select that elements. And I don't need to see it for all 10,000 people because that's way too much data. It just slows it down. So I just want to see it for, let's say, the first 10 cycles and the first, let's say, 10 individuals. And this just cuts down on the output so I don't get, and it won't take forever to run. If you turn, for example, if you turn this on to all and you don't limit it, it will take forever to finish 10,000 tries. It might not even finish because it will clog up the system with all the output. So it's useful to limit the output just so that it doesn't, get too unwieldy. So I've changed the thing to record a selected element for a limited number of cycles and a limited number of individual patients. And now I'm going to go into the variable properties, and I'm going to say I want to see PAE. So you see this little debug here. Check that box. So now when I run the model, it should tell me how PAE was calculated for the first 10 people in the first 10 cycles. So I can hide this again. Come back here, and I'm going to open the console. Right, this console here. Calculation trace, this is where the debugging output's going to come. I run my 10,000 people. Again, 1,000 is fine, doesn't matter. And here's my output being generated. I'll just go right up to the top. And sure enough, here's my calculation of PAE. Based on that definition we looked at before, the person just entered, so they couldn't have had any events already. I know they're in treatment 1. Right? Here's strategy 1. This state index tells me that they're in the local cancer state. And here's the 0.01. And if I looked at the table, I would see if you haven't had any adverse events in the past and you're in treatment 1 and you're in the local cancer state, this is the appropriate probability. And if I slide down a little bit, find somebody, right? Here's someone in treatment 2, right? And they get a different probability, even though they haven't had any adverse events yet. And I could go and keep looking through this to find different combinations of things. I'm hoping to find someone who's had an adverse event before, but I may not see that. Treatment 2, local cancer, it's 5%. Okay, here we're in treatment 2 in the metastasis state, and it's back to 10%. So I can use this output to validate the complicated expression in my model. And you should feel comfortable doing that anytime you want. Anytime you create a probability that is worthy of this level of scrutiny because it's complicated enough, I strongly recommend that you do this. So that's the debugging part of transparency. And I want to show you one more, before we finish, I want to show you one more piece of transparency. And I'm going to go back. Could you show it? Yes, absolutely. I could. There was a question. Could I show a later set of cycles? Absolutely. I could do 10 to. I happen to enter 1 to 10. 10 to 20 probably would have been a better idea because I would have had more people who had had more adverse events by then. So it would have been easier to find those. But I could also not limit it by cycle at all and just limit it by patient, and that would be fine. I just chose to do it that way. So the last piece of transparency I want to show you, and unfortunately you can only do this for cohort models. So I'm going to go back to the model we used before, Markov cancer decision. But for cohort models, as opposed to simulation models, that use this kind of pretty standard format of decision and Markov models for each, I can actually export that whole model to Excel. So I'm just exporting it to Excel. And this does not just benefit you with transparency, it also is good for sharing models. You might need to share a model with someone who doesn't have TreeAge Pro or someone who really prefers an Excel format. And say yes, and I'm going to enable the macro. And I have a fully functional Markov model converted to Excel. And if I really wanted to look at some of the details, And this 56.624K ICER is the same ICER from before, and it has its own inputs, and I could change them, and the ICER would change. But from a transparency perspective, I can look at treatment one, and I can see the formulas that did the work in TreeAge Pro also in Excel, and here they are. Like, here's my transition for survival. It's taking the people who were already there and applying the probabilities of something happening. So I could look at all these Excel formulas in here anywhere I want, and I could use that to validate the model if someone's more comfortable with validating a model in Excel. So not only is it a good sharing tool, it's also another mechanism to validate formulas in a cohort model. So that's really all I have to show you today. So I'm open to taking any questions that people may have. So I'll open that up and check the chat here. That question I already answered. We'll just wait another minute for anyone that wants to submit a question. Okay, well, I'll summarize in case another question comes in. So what I've tried to show you today is that when you build a TreeAge Pro model, there are a lot of ways that you can feel comfortable that it's doing what you want it to do, and you can show to other people to validate that as well. You've got your cohort reports that show you your patient flows and the accumulation of value. You've got your cohort reports and trial level reports that you can get from simulation models, and you can also get the debugging of individual calculations, complex calculations within the model. And then finally, you have that export to Excel, so you could look at the formulas in Excel. So let's go back to I'll try to address these questions. The state transition diagram is not really related to this, but it doesn't mean I can't show it. So anyone who's kind of done, thank you for joining me, but I will address these questions before we close. So this was a question about the survival chart. Yes, 3 events, I think you mean the 3 states. If I come back here and I run the cohort analysis report, let me close this for a second. I run the cohort analysis report. This state prob graph shows you the movement through all the states. So that relative to the survival curve, right? The survival curve is really the sum of the 2 non-dead states. So here's one non-dead state, here's the other one, there's your survival curve, right? Whereas this is a breakdown of all 3 states. So that, I think, addresses Louise's question. And then there was another question from Bill about the state transition diagram. So you can convert any Markov model to a state transition diagram or vice versa. So if I right-click on this and convert to unfortunately named STD, I don't need to save it. You get a state transition diagram representation, which is very nice if you want to have a simple representation, let's say for a poster or a presentation, and that can be useful when the tree gets really complicated and you don't really want people necessarily focusing on every complicated element. But you could change this and reformat it and make these bigger, etc. But this gives you a nice kind of simplified view of a Markov model. In addition, you can start with this and you can right-click and convert that to a Markov tree and make that the beginning of your building of a Markov model. So state transition diagrams go back and forth either way. So any other questions? I think not. So I'm going to close the session today. Thank you all for joining me. Really appreciate your time and look forward to additional webinars in the future.